A widow dug a trench between her cabin and her barn winter proved it was the smartest move she made. "Put the shovel down, Elizabeth. You're going to kill yourself out here," Samuel shouted over the howling November wind, violently grabbing the slick wooden handle of her spade. Elizabeth ripped it back, her knuckles white, her hands blistered and bleeding beneath frayed canvas gloves. She drove the heavy metal blade back into the freezing, rock-hard earth, her breath pluming in the bitter grey air. "The ground is freezing over," Samuel pleaded, staring at the jagged 4-foot-deep trench stretching from her back porch to the looming red barn. "It's absolute madness. William is gone. Digging a ditch won't bring him back." "I'm not digging a grave, Samuel," Elizabeth growled, her eyes fierce and unyielding as the very first snowflakes began to fall. "I'm digging a lifeline." The earth did not want to yield. It was late November, and the soil of the valley had already begun to harden into an impenetrable crust of frost and clay. Elizabeth brought the heavy iron pickaxe down with a bone-jarring thud, the impact vibrating up her forearms and settling deep into her aching shoulders. She grunted, wiping a mixture of sweat and freezing rain from her brow, and swung again. A small chunk of frozen dirt broke loose. She tossed the pickaxe aside, grabbed the spade, and shoveled the debris out of the 4-foot-deep, 3-foot-wide chasm she had been carving into her property for the last 3 weeks. To anyone watching from the county road, she looked like a woman who had entirely lost her grip on reality. Ever since William passed away in late August, Elizabeth had become a ghost of her former self. The townsfolk whispered in the aisles of the local grocery store. They said the grief had finally fractured her mind. After all, what sane woman in her late 50s spends her days performing the back-breaking labor of excavating a 50-yard trench between her back porch and her livestock barn, right on the precipice of winter? But Elizabeth was not driven by madness. She was driven by a promise, and by the haunting contents of her late husband's final journals. William had been a quiet, intensely observant man. In the last year of his life, his quietness had morphed into a frantic, feverish energy. He had spent his evenings poring over old farmers' almanacs, century-old meteorological records, and complex barometric charts he ordered from the city. In his final weeks, bedridden and struggling for breath, he had grabbed Elizabeth's hand with terrifying strength. "When the black frost comes, the sky will fall," he had wheezed, his eyes wide with a terrifying clarity. "Connect the hearth to the herd, Elizabeth. Do not let the snow blind you. Dig deep." She hadn't understood it then, but when she found his leather-bound journal on his desk, weeks after his funeral, the intricate blueprints sketched across the pages laid out exactly what he meant. He had predicted a cyclical, catastrophic superstorm, a 100-year winter that would bury the valley under insurmountable drifts. He had drawn a subterranean corridor connecting the cabin to the barn, and so, fueled by a potent mixture of grief, loyalty, and a creeping sense of dread as the autumn air grew unnaturally sharp, Elizabeth began to dig. The physical toll was immense. Her hands were a map of burst blisters and deep calluses. Her lower back throbbed with a relentless, dull agony that kept her awake at night, even after swallowing bitter willow bark tea. Every morning she rose before the sun, wrapped herself in William's oversized flannel coats, and went back to the trench. She lined the dirt walls with heavy wooden pallets and reclaimed timber from an old shed to prevent cave-ins. It was brutal, solitary work. Her closest neighbor, Samuel, a practical and stubbornly traditional farmer, had made it his personal mission to intervene. He drove his rusted pickup truck to her property every few days, bringing casseroles from his wife and an endless supply of unsolicited, heavy-handed advice. He would stand at the edge of the raw earth, shaking his head, his face a picture of deep pity and mounting frustration. "You are making a spectacle of yourself, Elizabeth," Samuel had told her one bleak Tuesday, watching her wrestle a heavy wooden support beam into the mud. "People are talking. They're saying you need to be evaluated. You're out here digging a moat like you expect a medieval siege. If you need help feeding the horses when the snow comes, I'll drive my tractor over. You don't need to do this." Elizabeth had paused, leaning on her shovel, her chest heaving. She looked at Samuel, seeing the genuine concern beneath his gruff exterior, but also seeing the total lack of comprehension. "You don't understand the weather that's coming, Samuel. The barometric pressure is dropping faster than I've ever seen. The birds left a month early. The deer have completely vanished from the tree line. Something terrible is moving down from the north." Samuel had sighed, a long, patronizing sound. "It's just winter, Elizabeth. We live in the mountains. It snows. We shovel. We survive. That's how it works. You are exhausting yourself for a delusion." She hadn't argued with him. Arguing took breath, and she needed every ounce of her breath for the dirt. She simply turned her back on him and resumed digging. Let them talk, she thought, as the cold mud soaked through the knees of her denim trousers. Let them call her crazy. She knew the texture of the air. It felt brittle, like snapping glass. She could smell the ice brewing in the upper atmosphere. By the third week of November, the trench was complete. It was a rugged, ugly scar across her picturesque property, but it was solid. Following William's meticulous diagrams, she spent the final 2 days before the forecasted freeze, laying heavy sheets of corrugated tin and thick plywood across the top of the trench, securing them to the wooden pallets. Finally, she shoveled a layer of excavated dirt and dead sod over the makeshift roof, effectively burying the structure. From the outside, it merely looked like a strange raised mound of earth stretching across the yard. But beneath it lay a dark, narrow, reinforced tunnel connecting the heavy oak door of her kitchen's mudroom directly to the side entrance of the large red barn. On the evening she finished, Elizabeth stood on her back porch, her muscles trembling with absolute exhaustion. She looked up at the sky. It was no longer grey. It was a bruised, terrifying shade of violet. The wind was completely dead. The silence was deafening, heavy, and pregnant with menace. As the first fat flakes of snow began to drift lazily down from the purple bruised heavens, Elizabeth locked her door, stoked the fire, and waited for her husband's prophecy to unfold. The storm did not arrive with a gradual crescendo. It descended upon the valley like a falling iron curtain. Just after midnight, the unnatural silence was shattered by a wind that sounded less like moving air and more like the roar of a massive freight train tearing through the pine forests. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in a matter of minutes, flash freezing the mud outside into solid rock. Elizabeth sat in her rocking chair by the hearth, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, listening to the agonizing groans of her cabin's timber frame as the gale battered the eastern walls. By morning, the world outside her windows had ceased to exist. There was only a swirling, chaotic void of blinding white. The snow wasn't falling. It was flying sideways, driven by 50-mile-per-hour gusts that rattled the window panes until they threatened to shatter. The frost crept up the inside of the glass, a creeping fractal pattern of ice that sealed the cabin in a frozen, claustrophobic bubble. Elizabeth went to the kitchen and turned the faucet. A pathetic sputter of brown water coughed out, followed by a hollow hiss. The pipes had frozen solid. The power had gone out hours ago, plunging the house into a deep, pervasive gloom, lit only by the flickering orange glow of the wood stove. She felt a knot of true terror tighten in her stomach. William had been right. This wasn't a normal winter storm. This was a catastrophic weather event. Around noon, through the deafening howl of the wind, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It was a rhythmic, desperate thumping, coming from her heavy front door. Elizabeth grabbed her heavy coat, picked up an iron fireplace poker just in case, and hurried to the entryway. She undid the deadbolt and pulled. The door wouldn't budge. The snow had already drifted several feet against it. She shoved with her shoulder, putting all her weight into it, managing to crack it open just enough. A flurry of white powder blasted into the hallway, followed by a large, snow-caked figure that stumbled inward and collapsed onto the hardwood floor. It was Samuel. Behind him, clinging to his coat with frozen, trembling hands, was Clara, a young mother who lived 2 miles down the road, clutching her 4-year-old son, Leo, tightly to her chest. Elizabeth quickly helped them push the door shut against the screaming wind, plunging the hallway back into dim quiet. They were completely covered in ice, their faces pale and blue, their eyelashes frozen together. Clara was sobbing silently, rocking little Leo, who was frighteningly lethargic and pale. "My truck!" Samuel gasped, his voice a ragged rasp. He was shivering violently, his teeth chattering so hard they sounded like a rattlesnake. Slid off the county road, into the ditch. Engine died. We tried to walk back to my place. Wind was too strong. We saw your chimney smoke. Elizabeth, I'm so sorry. I thought we were going to die out there. Get to the fire now. Elizabeth ordered, her instincts taking over. She didn't waste time on, "I told you so." She stripped them of their frozen coats, wrapped them in every blanket she owned, and pulled them close to the wood stove. As the hours dragged on, the true severity of their situation settled over them like a suffocating shroud. The storm outside only seemed to gain ferocity. The radio broadcast a single, broken emergency message before dying completely. The entire county was under a state of emergency. All plows were grounded. The roads were impassable. People were ordered to shelter in place. And then, dead static. By the evening of the second day, the snowdrifts had reached the roofline of the cabin, completely burying the windows. The only light came from the fire. The cabin felt like a tomb. Samuel sat with his head in his hands, staring blankly at the dancing flames. The arrogant, practical farmer had been entirely broken by the sheer, unfeeling power of nature. "My livestock," he whispered, his voice cracking. "They're out in the open pastures. They're going to freeze to death. I didn't bring them into the barn. I didn't think it would be this bad." Clara rocked Leo, who was coughing weakly, a dry, rattling sound that sent spikes of panic through Elizabeth's heart. "Elizabeth, do you have any more food?" Clara asked quietly, her eyes rimmed with red. "Leo hasn't eaten since yesterday morning. I'm sorry to ask. I know you weren't expecting company." Elizabeth walked over to her pantry and opened the wooden door. The shelves were alarmingly bare. She had been so consumed with digging the trench and fortifying the exterior that she had neglected to drive into town for her final winter provisions. There was half a box of stale crackers, 2 cans of tomato soup, and a small jar of peanut butter. That was it, for 3 adults and a sick child. She portioned out a quarter of the soup, heating it over the wood stove, and fed it to Leo. The adults ate nothing. The hunger began to gnaw at their bellies, a sharp, physical pain that amplified the freezing temperature in the room. The firewood pile next to the hearth was shrinking at an alarming rate. At this pace, they would run out of fuel in less than 24 hours. "We aren't going to make it," Samuel said suddenly, breaking the heavy silence. His eyes were wide with a stark, terrifying realization. The plow won't come for days. If the cold doesn't get us when the wood runs out, the hunger will. We're trapped in a box. Elizabeth looked at the dying embers. then turned her gaze toward the heavy wooden door in the mudroom. The door that led to the outside, the door that led to the trench. "We are not going to die, Samuel," Elizabeth said, her voice dropping into a register of absolute, unbreakable resolve. "I have a barn full of firewood. I just have to go get it." "Are you insane?" Samuel barked, standing up, his fear turning into sudden anger. "You can't open that door. The snowdrift is probably 10 feet high against it. If you try to dig through that in this wind, you will be buried alive. You'll freeze to death before you make it 10 yards. Elizabeth walked toward the mudroom. "I don't have to dig through the snow, Samuel," she said softly, placing her hand on the cold iron latch of the door. "I just have to walk under it." The air inside the mudroom was bitterly cold, smelling of wet wool and damp wood. Elizabeth unbolted the heavy deadbolt on the exterior door. Samuel stood a few feet behind her, his face pale, holding a lantern. Clara huddled by the fading fire in the next room, holding Leo, praying silently. "Elizabeth, please," Samuel begged, his voice cracking. "I mocked you. I was wrong. I was arrogant. But please do not do this. It's a suicide mission. If the roof of that ditch caves in, you'll be crushed under thousands of pounds of snow. We won't be able to dig you out." "William told me to connect the hearth to the herd," Elizabeth replied, not looking back. She pulled a heavy wool scarf over her nose and mouth and grabbed an empty canvas duffel bag. He knew this was coming. He knew. She pushed the door open. Instead of a solid wall of white, blinding snow, she was met with a gaping, pitch-black void. The trench. The corrugated tin and plywood roof she had built was holding. Above it, an estimated 12 feet of snow had piled up, acting as a massive, heavy blanket of insulation. The air inside the tunnel was freezing, but it was dead still. There was no wind. There was no howling storm. Just the terrifying, oppressive scent of deep earth and darkness. Elizabeth stepped into the void, turning on a heavy-duty flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the narrow, dirt-walled corridor. The wooden pallets she had used for support looked frail in the harsh light. The plywood ceiling above her was bowing slightly, visibly groaning under the immense, crushing weight of the snowdrifts above. A fine dusting of dirt fell from the ceiling, landing on her shoulders. "Wait here," she told Samuel, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Keep the fire going with whatever you have left. Burn the chairs if you have to." Without another word, she began her descent. The trench was 50 yards long, but in the dark, with the ceiling pressing down mere inches above her head, it felt like 50 miles. It was a psychological nightmare. Every step she took was accompanied by the terrifying creak and snap of the timber above her. The air was incredibly thin, heavy with the smell of clay and frost. It felt exactly like walking into her own grave. She had to stoop low, her back aching furiously in the same places the digging had ravaged weeks prior. "Keep moving," she chanted internally. "Left foot, right foot, don't look up." Halfway through the tunnel, the flashlight beam flickered and died. Elizabeth froze, engulfed in an absolute, suffocating blackness. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her chest. Her breath hitched. The walls felt like they were shrinking, closing in on her. She could hear the storm raging violently far above her, a muffled, demonic roar that sent vibrations down through the dirt. A loud crack echoed through the tunnel as a support beam shifted under the weight. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the overwhelming urge to scream, to turn around, and scramble blindly back to the cabin. But in the darkness, she saw William's face. She saw his ink-stained fingers tracing the blueprints. "Do not let the snow blind you. Dig deep. She smacked the flashlight hard against her palm. Once, twice. The yellow beam flickered back to life, weak but steady. She let out a ragged breath and pushed forward. The remaining 25 yards were pure agony. Her knees ached, her lungs burned, and the cold seeped through her heavy boots, turning her toes entirely numb. But finally, the yellow beam of light caught the solid, weather-beaten wood of the barn's lower foundation. She reached the small access door she had cut into the side of the barn. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely manipulate the heavy iron latch. With a final, desperate heave, she threw her weight against the wood. The door swung open, and she tumbled forward, spilling onto the dry, sweet-smelling hay of the barn floor. She lay there for a moment, gasping for air, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was alive. She had made it. She sat up and shined the light around. The barn was freezing, but the walls blocked the deadly wind. Her 2 draft horses, sensing her presence, whinnied nervously from their stalls, stamping their heavy hooves. Elizabeth stood up, dusting the dirt from her coat. She walked over to the immense stack of split firewood corded against the back wall. She began to load the heavy oak logs into her canvas duffel bag, her mind focused solely on getting back to the cabin to save Clara's baby. As she reached for a log near the bottom of the stack, her flashlight beam caught something strange. The hay on the floor had been brushed away, revealing a thick, heavy steel ring bolted to a square wooden trapdoor cut directly into the barn's floorboards. Elizabeth frowned, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. She had owned this property for 30 years. She knew every inch of this barn. There had never been a trapdoor here. She dropped the firewood and knelt beside it. The wood looked newly cut, the hinges fresh and unrusted. There was a small hand-carved symbol burned into the wood next to the handle. It was the same symbol William used to sign his journal entries. Trembling, she reached out, grasped the freezing steel ring, and pulled with all her remaining strength. The heavy door groaned open, revealing a steep set of concrete stairs leading down into total darkness. A blast of air rushed up from the hole, but it wasn't freezing. It was surprisingly warm, smelling of dried herbs, cured salt, and dry earth. Elizabeth swallowed hard, gripping her flashlight tightly. She slowly descended the stairs, her boots echoing in the cavernous space. When she reached the bottom, she swept the flashlight across the room, and the breath entirely left her lungs. She stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth, tears instantly springing to her eyes. It wasn't just a root cellar. It was a subterranean fortress. The space beneath the barn was massive, lined with thick, insulated foam boarding and concrete block. The flashlight beam danced across rows upon rows of heavy-duty metal shelving, reaching up to the ceiling. The shelves were packed with an unimaginable bounty. There were hundreds of glass masonry jars filled with preserved vegetables, bright orange carrots, deep red beets, emerald green beans, and golden peaches. There were massive plastic bins, labeled with William's meticulous handwriting: wheat, rice, oats, flour. Hanging from heavy iron hooks in the far corner were dozens of cured, salt-encrusted hams and links of dried sausage. But it wasn't just food. Another wall was dedicated entirely to medical and emergency supplies. There were stacks of thick wool blankets, boxes of antibiotics, bandages, heavy-duty kerosene lanterns, 50-gallon drums of purified water, and, in a neatly organized section that made Elizabeth sob aloud, rows of baby formula, powdered milk, and infant medicine. On a small wooden desk in the center of the room sat a single kerosene lamp and a stack of ledgers. Elizabeth walked over, her hands shaking, and opened the top book. It was a manifest, but beside the lists of supplies were names: Miller family, 4 kids, need extra oats. Henderson, diabetic, needs canned meats, low sugar. Clara and baby Leo, formula, infant Tylenol, high priority. Samuel will lose his winter crop, needs seed and grain for spring. Elizabeth fell to her knees, the flashlight slipping from her grasp and rolling across the concrete floor. She wept, deep, racking sobs that echoed in the silent, warm cellar. William hadn't lost his mind. He hadn't just been preparing to save himself, or even just her. He had spent the last ounce of his fading life, his failing breath, spending their savings and digging in secret under the barn, to save the very town that had mocked him. He knew they wouldn't listen to his warnings. He knew they would call him crazy. So he built an ark in the dark, and he left his wife the map to find it. Connect the hearth to the herd. The trench wasn't just to get to the animals. The trench was the only way to access the survival bunker when the 20-foot snowdrifts inevitably buried the barn doors. He had orchestrated the entire thing, relying on Elizabeth's stubborn strength to finish the final link, wiping her tears. A new, fierce energy flooded Elizabeth's veins. She wasn't just a widow surviving a storm anymore. She was the guardian of her husband's legacy. She grabbed a large wooden sled she found near the stairs. She loaded it with firewood, jars of hearty beef stew, a box of crackers, blankets, and a tin of baby formula and medicine for Leo. She dragged the heavy sled up the stairs, closed the trap door, and maneuvered it to the entrance of the trench. The journey back through the tunnel was just as dark, just as terrifying, but Elizabeth felt no fear. She pulled the heavy sled behind her, the runners slicing through the dirt. The groaning timber above sounded less like a threat and more like a protective shield. When she finally pushed open the mudroom door, Samuel was pacing frantically, his face grey with despair. When he saw her emerge, covered in dirt but completely unharmed, hauling a massive sled of unimaginable treasures, he fell to his knees. "How?" Samuel gasped, staring at the jars of food and the medicine. "Elizabeth, how is this possible?" Elizabeth walked past him, carrying the formula and medicine directly to Clara, who wept with immediate, profound relief, holding her crying baby. Elizabeth turned back to Samuel, dropping an armful of dry firewood next to the dying stove. "William knew," she said quietly, her voice echoing with a profound, unshakable pride. "He built a cellar under the barn. It's fully stocked, enough to feed our side of the valley for months. He made lists, Samuel. He made a list of what you would need when your crops failed. He made a list for Clara's boy." Samuel stared at her, the reality of her words sinking in, shattering his pride into a million pieces. Tears welled in the hardened farmer's eyes. He looked at the food, then at the dark doorway leading to the trench. The man he had called crazy, the man he had laughed at, had spent his dying days ensuring Samuel's survival. For the next 4 days, the blizzard raged, burying the world above. But below, in the cabin, there was warmth. There was hot stew, warm milk for the baby, and the crackle of a steady fire. Elizabeth made the trek through the trench twice a day, bringing back supplies, feeding the horses, and pulling from the incredible bounty of her husband's love. When the storm finally broke on the 6th day, the sky cleared to a brilliant, blinding blue. The world was unrecognizable, buried under a sea of white. When the rescue crews finally managed to bulldoze their way down the county road 3 days later, expecting to find frozen bodies in the isolated cabins, they found something entirely different. They found a neighborhood sustained. They found smoke rising steadily from Elizabeth's chimney, and they found a community, led by a humbled Samuel, already working together to clear the snow, sharing the life-saving supplies pulled from a secret cellar, connected by a muddy trench that a brave widow had dug with her own bleeding hands. The trench was no longer a scar on the earth. It was a monument to a love that looked beyond ridicule and a perseverance that refused to yield. William's foresight and Elizabeth's grueling labor proved that true preparation isn't driven by fear, but by a profound, selfless love for others, even those who fail to understand it. We never truly know the burdens others carry, or the unseen bridges they are building to save us. If this story of enduring love, hidden sacrifice, and ultimate redemption moved you, please share this with someone you care about, and subscribe for more cinematic stories.